The video you're about to watch is an excerpt from two long conversations I've had with Michael Shellenberger. In the video, I say that, in my view, mental illnesses should be divided into two groups. The so-called mental illnesses with a biological, neurological, physiological basis, these mental illnesses should be removed from the DSM and introduced into classical medical textbooks. These are medical conditions with psychological or mental expressions and manifestations. I also suggest that all the other so-called mental illnesses are not illnesses at all. They are relational, or they have to do with social expectations and mores. They are more social problems than clinical entities. They are also highly dependent on context, changed in context, and they either disappear or they become positive adaptations, in other words, mentally healthy reactions. Having said all that, I also said that I consider Donald Trump and Elon Musk narcissists to be narcissists. I consider them to be people with narcissistic personality disorder, which is, by current definitions, a mental illness. And then Michael, in his own inimitable, gracious and gentle way, suggested that I may be contradicting myself. On the one hand, I say that these so-called mental illnesses are not illnesses at all. On the other hand, when it comes to Donald Trump and Elon Musk, I am all too ready to apply the label of mentally ill to these two personalities. What gives? Am I being hypocritical? So I would like to disambiguate and explain myself a bit more, and then you'll be able to watch the excerpt and make up your own minds. Most of what we call today mental illness, as I said, are actually relational, societal dysfunctions, anomalies, variances. I suggest that there is a huge variance and variability in the human mind, and that pathologizing a part of this spectrum is not helpful unless it can be unambiguously and unequivocally reduced into a neurobiological, biochemical, or physiological condition. In other words, unless it is actually a medical problem. But unfortunately, we all have to use the vernaculars and the vocabularies we are given. When I use this vernacular, this vocabulary, and when I say Trump and Musk are mentally ill, what I actually mean to say is Trump and Musk are a danger to society. They do not conform to the statistical mean or average when it comes to interpersonal relationships and social functioning. And because of this nonconformity, they hurt people, they harm people, they're dangerous in many ways. That's all I'm trying to say. So I conform, I follow the relational societal undercurrent in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and to a large extent in the International Classification of Diseases. I call it mentally ill because there's no other language. There's no other way to say this. Neurodivergent is an idiotic word, mind you, and I've explained why I consider it a stupid word in another video. So I'm not going to use this word. All I'm left with is mentally ill, realizing and understanding that most mental illnesses in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual actually are not medical, clinical entities. They represent failures or problems or anomalies or dysfunctions or deviance in social interactions and interpersonal relationships. I'm forced to use the phrase mentally ill because in my discipline, all alternative vocabularies have been roundly rejected. See, for example, the much maligned work by Thomas Szasz and by Laing. In both cases, they proposed a new language, and they have been soundly rebuffed and excommunicated, actually. So we are left only with this highly inadequate and many times counterfactual dictionary. And so, having said that, we should be able to identify predators, psychopaths, narcissists, people who are harmful to themselves and to others, and we should be able to protect ourselves against them. And yes, in my view, and it has been my view since March 2016, when I was the first to propose that Donald Trump suffers from narcissistic personality disorder in an interview I gave to American Thinker, a conservative website. So it has always been my view, and it is my view now, that both Donald Trump and Elon Musk are dangerous people. And the only words I have to express this is to say that they're both seriously sick and mentally ill. I disagree with the pathologizing of human behaviors, human propensities, and human traits, which are on a basically infinite spectrum. The same way I disagree with the pathologizing of some sexual behaviors or sexual propensities, predilections, and preferences, sexual orientations. I disagree. I don't think homosexuality should have ever been pathologized, for example. Gender dysphoria also, in my view, is wrongly pathologized. But having said that, we need to accept the arbitrary designation of mental illness when we come to describe it, come to tackle, come to attempt to understand someone like Donald Trump or an Elon Musk. Two people who are seriously abnormal, if that's a more acceptable word. They deviate from normality in ways which are seriously harmful and deleterious and problematic, not so much to themselves as to everyone around them. Those who are brainwashed and belong to their cults will come to regret it. Those who are not are already suffering. And now, on to our conversation regarding the current state of psychology and how very often it has been and is weaponized.
And welcome to public.
Thank you. Happy to be in public finally.
Great to be here. My readers will see an introduction to you, but here's your terrific book. I think can be safe to be said it's a classic in the field. You're an expert on narcissism.
Thank you.
We've spoken before. I'm eager to speak with you again because we're spending even more time looking at your ideas and ideas around psychopathology generally. I thought we could start with a broader question. I'm very curious to hear your view of how you think about psychopathologies in general. We tend to think, at least in the popular discourse, I'm not so sure about in the expert discourse, we tend to think about different categories. We talk about serious mental illness, in which I believe we classify things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. There's also psychiatric disorders, and then there's personality disorders. And I wonder, is that how you divide up different psychopathologies? And I'm also curious to hear your view of those who argue that there's really just a single psychopathology that manifests differently in different people, and how your own views may vary from those of the conventional views.
I'll start with first of all, thank you for having me, for the opportunity.
Thanks for
I'll
coming
start
on.
with the last part of the question. Actually, what people are some scholars are claiming is that there is a single personality disorder.
Okay.
And that single personality disorder is the only viable clinical entity, and it manifests in a variety of ways with different emphasis on different trait domains. And this is the philosophy that has been incorporated into the 11th edition of the International Classification of Diseases, which is a diagnostic manual in use by 80% of humanity. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is actually in use only in North America and some parts of the United Kingdom, less than 20% of humanity.
Hmm.
So the dominant diagnostic manual does not recognize the separateness of alleged personality disorders,
Hmm.
but groups them all together under a single umbrella And what they do is a Lego approach in the ICD, in the International Classification. There's a Lego approach. There's a list of traits, and when a patient attends therapy or in a clinical setting or whatever, you just pick and choose the traits that apply to the patient. You combine them into a highly idiosyncratic, individualized profile, which fits the patient like hand in glove. Obviously, all the problems inherent in the DSM are avoided this way. We don't have comorbidities. We don't have what we call the polythetic problem, where you could end up having the same diagnosis as I do, and yet we share only one criterion in common. Because there's a list of 9 criteria, and you need to satisfy 5 of them. You need to meet 5 of them. And so I could have criteria number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and you would have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We would both have the same diagnosis, but the only thing in common we would have is criterion number 5, which is, of course, ridiculous. All this is avoided with the ICD. So this is the answer to the latter part of your question. As to the first part, there's always been a debate whether the notion of mental illness is not merely some kind of an experiment in social control or social engineering, whether it's real, whether what we call mental illnesses are verifiable, veritable clinical entities, the same way cancer is, or tuberculosis, or whatever. And the answer is very compounded, because clearly there's a group of mental illnesses which are biological or neurobiological in nature, that this could be developmental, biochemical, whatever. We can trace them back to the body. And then this would include schizophrenia and probably autism spectrum disorder. We're beginning to believe that ADHD belongs there, and so on and so forth. Because they're traceable back to the body, in my humble opinion, they should be removed from the DSM. They're actually medical conditions. These medical conditions manifest in what used to be called psychological ways, but these are medical conditions through and through. We know, for example, this psychotic disorders, schizophrenia being among them. These are utterly biochemically determined in the brain. So there is this group, which is unequivocal, and there's not much debate about this group. However, the overwhelming vast majority of other mental disorders and mental illnesses and mental issues and mental what have you, they're highly debatable. And they're highly debatable, first and foremost, because they reflect values and beliefs. They are doxastic. They're axiological. They're not clinical. They're not monovalent. They're not. So homosexuality used to be a mental illness until 1973. And now it's not. Similarly, in my opinion, antisocial personality disorder has nothing to do with mental illness. It's a preference, it's a personal style, it's someone who does not respect the rule of law, someone who is defiant and reckless, considers society to be comprised of weaklings and exploitable opportunities. Someone who is not nice to be with, you wouldn't want to get married with them or become a good friend with them, but I don't see where the mental illness is here, you know? There's a big debate about narcissistic personality disorder. These people used to be called a-holes before the DSM came on board. Also there. And to generalize the problem, these are relational disorders. If you isolate a narcissist, and there's a big question whether the diagnosis remains. A narcissist can be a narcissist only in relationship to other people. Otherwise, the narcissism is not discernible, not diagnosable. The very language of the criteria, including the alternative model in the DSM, which is the latest innovation in diagnosing narcissistic personality disorder, all these criteria, the entire text discusses the narcissist's relationship or relatedness to other people, incapacity to experience intimacy, inability to empathize with people, exploitativeness, envy, and so on. it's directional, it's relational, it's context dependent. It's exactly like you would say, well, tuberculosis erupts only when you spend time in a cruise ship with middle class white males. Obviously, it's not a clinical entity. So there's a problem here. There are additional problems, of course, and but I think this is the core issue. The fact that take away the context and the diagnosis disappears. That's an extremely bad sign that we are dealing with cultural judgments. We call it culture-bound syndrome. Cultural judgments, we're dealing with prejudices, we're dealing with biases, and so on. One could conceive of civilizations where narcissistic personality disorder would be a positive adaptation and a competitive edge or advantage. One could definitely recall civilizations in the past where psychotic disorder was revered and venerated because these people were in direct contact with God. They were emissaries, they were prophets, they were, So psychotic disorder was considered to be a sign of elevation, social elevation, membership in some hallowed elite, and so on. So it's whenever we discuss mental health, behind all this, there is the Cartesian problem, or older than the Cartesian problem, of body-mind. Is there such a thing as mind that is utterly irreducible to the body? And if there is, these deviations, when they are context dependent, do they represent something that is invariable, something that is objective, something that is, ontological, or do they represent some flaws perhaps and biases in epistemic processes, in the epistemology of the whole thing? And we're very far from having an answer to this.
Do you have an opinion about that yourself?
I think the DSM, when it was first published in 1952, had 109 pages. Today, the DSM is 1,168 pages. I don't know of any other field which has experienced such explosive growth in the space of 70 years. It's a strong indication that something is seriously wrong with the profession, with the discipline. I believe that well over 90% of the things in the DSM should be completely removed. These are not illnesses, these are not even disorders. These are variations on a theme, and the theme is the human soul, or the human psyche, or call it whatever you wish, the human mind. We refuse to accept variability. It was Erich Fromm, the famous psychoanalyst, who said that we are using psychology and psychiatry to force people to conform to industrial expectations, to become productive workers or productive consumers or whatever. So this is a social scheme, or scam. It's about social control. It's not so much about medicine or, again, with the exception of disorders or illnesses that can be directly traceable to the body and where intervention has immediate impact. And so hallucinations, for example, you give Thorazine, the hallucinations disappear. End of story. But these should not be as in the DSM. These are not mental illnesses. These are medical conditions.
And is that your view both of personality disorders and psychiatric disorders, or just personality disorders?
Listen, the discipline is a pseudoscience. That's a problem. Psychology, forget psychiatry. Psychiatry is glorified prescriptions. Psychiatry is the glorified science of handing out prescriptions. Yeah? So it's a branch of pharmacology, in effect. So forget psychiatry, put it aside. Psychology, including clinical psychology, perhaps especially clinical psychology, because there's a lot to be said for developmental psychology and child psychology and so on. When it comes to clinical psychology, it's a pseudoscience. And even worse, it can never become a science for a variety of reasons. Let's start with the fact that your subject matter is very malleable and very mutable. The very fact that you're conducting a study or an experiment on a human being changes that person.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you try to replicate the study, even using the same people, they're not the same people anymore. 24 hours have elapsed.
Mm-hmm.
They got divorced in the meantime. They got laid. I don't know. They're changed people, you know? So there's a problem with the subject matter. Then there's a problem with the undergeneration of hypotheses, because the field is highly non-rigorous and relies on non-representative or self-selecting samples. It is unable to come with testable hypotheses. Consequently, we have the replication crisis. 80%, 80% of all studies and experiments in psychology cannot be replicated, never mind what you do. What kind of science is this? This is a core problem. These people, they use statistics, they think they're scientists. I have a PhD in physics. That's a science. Used to be. Even there, the situation is deteriorating, but used to be a science when I studied physics. That's a science. Using statistics doesn't make you a scientist. Wearing a white robe in a government-funded laboratory doesn't make you a scientist. Makes you perhaps a con artist, but not a scientist. There's no science there. Psychology is a branch of literature, exactly like economics, by the way, which is a branch of psychology. These so-called social sciences, these are pseudosciences. And what they're good at is descriptive. They're very good at capturing situations. They're very good at leveraging language to somehow capture the essence of some condition or some environment or some interaction or some people, specific group of people and so on. So yes, there's value, there's merit in psychology. I'm not, but it's not a science. Dostoevsky was possibly the most preeminent psychologist ever. So, and Freud, of course, considered himself a neurologist. And by the way, a lawyer. Very few people know that. He considered himself a neurologist. But what really was, he was a great author, and he wrote wonderful literature, essays and stuff, and flights of the imagination, and all kinds of inventions, and plagiarizing here, there, a few of his colleagues, all of his colleagues actually. So this was a guy. Similarly, when we go today to the behavioral scientists and the experimental scientists, and it's nonsense. It wouldn't pass master first year in physics. So I'm disenchanted with this whole pretension to science. That's a long way of answering your question.
Sam, what are the implications of what you're saying?
The implications are that we should stop pathologizing the wide spectrum, the incredibly wide spectrum of human behavior. The human brain is by far the most complex entity we know of in the entire universe. I have the benefit of being an astrophysicist on the one hand and a professor of psychology on the other. So I can compare definitely the brain is so hyper complex that it puts the universe to ridicule. The universe is nothing compared to the brain. So inevitably, the brain produces behaviors which are highly variable on a spectrum that is infinitely wide and cannot be reduced or captured or fully described ever, period. So when we are faced with this variability, instead of developing a sense of humility and modesty, neuroscientists, for example, claim to fully understand the brain and discover specific genes that cause you to gamble pathologically or to lie or to sleep with your wife if you have one, or if you don't have a wife, there's another gene for that, and so on. And there's another brain synapse and another area of the brain that this is so immature. It's a pursuit of celebrity at the sacrifice of integrity. It's immature, it's wrong. So we need to humbly accept the variability of human nature. We need to stop pathologizing everything that does not conform to our middle-class Western male uh, prejudices and biases. It's called weirdo, the weird bias, white, you know. So, and then we need to begin to think about some of these things positively, from the positive, the advantages that they confer. It's extremely unlikely that evolution would have given rise to developments which would have been detrimental to our future. And I'm not talking about psychosis and so on. These, again, are malfunctions of a complex machine. Okay, happens with your laptop, let alone with your brain. No? I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about variations of style, variations of preferences, variations of emotionality, and so on. Rather than pathologize them, we should begin to ask ourselves, why did evolution give rise to them? How can we leverage the advantages embedded in them, the advantages they reify? What was the intention of all this? Because we tend to anthropomorphose evolution. We say that it's goal-oriented. What was the goal, so to speak? Well, what did evolution have in mind when it gave rise to narcissism or to psychopathy? And indeed, there's a growing kind of trend in academia where scholars are beginning to ask themselves, perhaps psychopathy is a positive adaptation in certain circumstances. So, for example, leaders, perhaps. We have psychopathic leaders are better leaders. Psychopathic surgeons, we know that psychopathic surgeons are better surgeons. We know that there's an overrepresentation of psychopaths among chief executive officers of Fortune 500 companies. That's a fact. So maybe it's some kind of positive adaptation depending on the circumstances. Of course, we shouldn't let psychopaths run amok and rampant in every situation, in every context, but maybe we can use them, harness this energy, harness this power. Similarly with narcissists, borderlines, and so on. So rather, I think we should completely flip our viewpoint. Rather than focusing on pathologizing and by implication inferiorizing, because you're mentally ill, I'm superior to you, I'm healthy, rather than create these instant hierarchies of flawed human beings and allegedly perfect human beings, which is a defense mechanism known as splitting. It's an infantile defense mechanism. I'm the therapist, I'm the psychologist, I'm perfect, close to perfect. I'm the standard. You are the patient. You're flawed, you're deformed, you're defective, you're damaged. I'm going to fix you. There's a lot of pathology in the therapeutic process, a lot. And not all of it is on the side of the patient. So we need to get rid of this paradigm. This paradigm is relatively new. When psychology has been conjured up, and it has been conjured up, in the late 19th century, scholars such as Wundt in Germany and James in the United States, they didn't discuss pathology. The focus was not on pathology. The focus was on understanding the human mind, attention, memory, and so on. Pathology was nowhere to be seen. Where the concept of pathology emerged was essentially in France, in Paris, where there was a group of con artists, kidding you not, who came up with this concept of pathology, established hospitals, and made a fortune of this new notion, completely novel notion. This notion was so groundbreaking, so mind-shattering, that people like Sigmund Freud traveled all the way to Paris to study this perplexingly novel idea of pathology, mental illness. Mental illness is a very new invention, very new. If you were to go back to the time of Jesus, there were no mentally ill people. There were people in touch with God, obviously, like Jesus himself, but there were no mentally ill people. There were people who were dysfunctional, so their families were very protective of them. Even the family of Jesus wanted to kind of protect him from his own devices and misbehavior and so on. But they didn't say, he's crazy, we're going to... There was no such no such idea. It all emerged in Paris. And then, of course, Freud realized what it could do for his career. He had a floundering career. He was a coke addict. He was, at the very end, he was hitting rock bottom. And then he came across the idea of pathology. I mean, in Paris. He went there, he met Charcot, he met Janet, he met all these guys. And he returned to Vienna and he established psychoanalysis. And from that moment on, we are stuck with the idea of mental illness. From that moment on. Psychoanalysis has been discarded as a scam, widely discarded as a scam. Definitely in modern Western academia is not taught and is not. Carl Sagan, in his book, The Demon Haunted World, mentions psychoanalysis as a prime example of a scam. So, but many of the ideas of psychoanalysis, the seeds planted, sprouted, the unconscious, for example, or the very concept of pathology. And that's how it all started. I think we need to get rid of the whole field and to say these evidently clear clinical entities are medical conditions equivalent to cancer or whatever, and all the rest is nonsense and should be deleted. None of it is real.
Meaning the serious mental illnesses, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, you would
The
keep
biologically traceable mental illnesses, mental illnesses that have a biological template and neurobiological engine. These are real, but they're medical conditions. So they should teach them in, and the rest of so-called psychology, we should begin to treat it as literature, descriptive, nice, interesting, fascinating, and so on, but not science. Psychiatry is just the pharmacology of the medical conditions that we used to call mental illnesses, like psychosis, like schizophrenia, yes, like bipolar, so we need psychiatry because they know which medicines to give. End of story.
Sam, you mentioned that the various personality disorders have positive benefits, and you gave the example of psychopathy and the leadership qualities of it. Can you describe the benefits of the other personality disorders you mentioned, narcissism and borderline?
There are no. It's a fascinating question. I'll explain to you why. We tend to attribute values. So we say depression is bad. Like, who would say depression is good? Find me one person who would say depression is a great thing, best things in sliced bread. Who would say that? No one would say that. Everyone agrees it's bad. That's not true. There's no bad and good. There's context. And I'll give you an example where depression is actually a sign of mental health. Auschwitz. If you were not depressed in Auschwitz, we were mentally ill. If you were happy-go-lucky, cheerful, joyful, smiling and laughing in Auschwitz, you would admit that something was wrong with this kind of person. Depression was a healthy reaction in Auschwitz. It denoted mental health. Mentally healthy people in Auschwitz were depressed. So as you can see, context matters dramatically. Same with these personality disorders. They're not good or bad in essence. There are no advantages or disadvantages which are inherent and which are emergent and which are context independent, non-contextualized. That's not the case. But in certain contexts, these personality disorders constitute evolutionary advantages and positive adaptations. I give an example of the psychopath, a military leader. It's an advantage to be a psychopath because you need to send people to their death and you need to sleep well at night after that. And you need to have dinner and breakfast and so on. And you've just killed actually. You were an agent in the death of 600 people or 6,000 people, or like Napoleon, 60,000 people. So psychopathy is very helpful when you're a military leader or a politician who is sending people to their death via military leaders. Same with a surgeon. What surgeons do, they cut people with knives. That's what they do. They take a knife and they cut you. In most contexts, you would end up in prison for doing this, or worse. But in the context of the operating room, you're revered and venerated for your accomplishments as a surgeon. So it helps to be a psychopath when you're a surgeon. So that's an example of psychopathy in action in context, in highly specific context. Similarly, a narcissist, for example, narcissism would be very helpful when you're an entrepreneur and establishing a startup. Because to establish a startup, you need to have a grandiose vision of yourself. So you need to have the vision thing, Bush, not the vision thing. And you need to believe in yourself in a way which is delusional, counterfactual. Otherwise, you're a bad entrepreneur and your startup will flop. And a prime example, of course, is Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk should have been bankrupt like 9 times already. And none of his companies should have succeeded, and none of his endeavors and enterprises and initiatives. Yet, he is an extreme narcissist. And that kept him alive and his companies floating and made him the richest man in the world. Possibly also one of the most influential ones. All because of his narcissism. People ask me, is narcissism bad? Should they be treated? I said, vast majority of cases, it's a good idea to somehow intervene and isolate the narcissist nearest and dearest from the most egregious outcomes of narcissism. But imagine that I go to Donald Trump and I tell him, Don, we're on first name basis. Don, listen, I'm an authority on narcissism, and I think you're a narcissist, and you need help. I'm going to help you free of charge. You're the president. Would look good on my resume. I'm going to help you free of charge. He's going to ask me, why do you think I need help? I'm a multi-billionaire, twice elected president. I had all the most gorgeous women in the world. What? Why would I need help? My narcissism was a positive adaptation, had he been able to say such a sentence. Yeah? My narcissism is a positive adaptation. It led me places. It is my biography. It's without my narcissism, I probably wouldn't be here. So it's context dependent. Similarly, let's take, for example, the paranoid personality disorder. It's very good to be paranoid when you are in a hostile environment, environment that is out to get you. To be a paranoid in such environment has a survival value. And I can continue with each and every one. Borderline personality disorder, which is
I was going to ask.
Borderline much castigated. It's considered to be the pits, The critical feature in borderline personality disorder is what is known as emotional dysregulation. It's when the borderline is overwhelmed by his or her emotions, drowns in them, is incapable of controlling them, and they disable her or render her dysfunctional. That's a key feature in borderline. There are other features, of course, but that's a key feature. Let's focus on this one. Emotional dysregulation is either reactive, it reflects something that has happened in the environment, in other words, exogenous, or endogenous. It is reactive to something that's happening inside the borderline. And it has the pronounced advantage of disambiguating situations. Whereas the vast majority of us we are very dishonest in communicating emotions. For example, you may be sitting there and thinking, who is this asshole? Why am I spending time with him? And so on. But you're extremely unlikely to communicate this. We're extremely dishonest. 90% of human communication is dishonest, if not more. The borderline is very honest about her emotions because she can't help it. So there is a template of honest emotional communication. She externalizes the emotions. She can also externalize aggression. Whatever you say about borderline, it's an honest disorder. Now, in situations where honesty is at a premium or has survival value, in these situations, the borderline would have an advantage. So, for example, I think that borderlines would have an advantage in show business, where the externalization of emotions and the ability to experience them in a direct, unmitigated, unmediated way
would have a tremendous advantage. And I think many actors are actually borderlines. Actors, rock stars, I mean, many of these celebrities, I think they're actually borderline. I don't know, I haven't diagnosed them, but they appear. The biography seems to be. Amy Winehouse, you know, this type. They're borderlines. It comes at a cost, obviously, at a personal cost. But it's also an adaptation. They wouldn't have become famous and creative. And indeed, just to finish the answer, I think, for example, a famous psychologist, suggested that creativity is intimately linked with what he called psychoticism. So he linked creativity with mental illness, which now is mainstream. We do believe that a modicum of what we call mental illness, and I call variability, a modicum of mental illness is required for you to be creative. So nothing is bad or good. Nothing is advantageous and disadvantageous. Nothing is wrong and right. Nothing. It depends 100%, 1000% on the context. As simple as it.